A light, steady snow descended on Moscow, cloaking the city's buildings and streets in a soft blanket of white. It was a chilly evening, the kind where lamplight glowed against the darkness, and the faint crunch of boots on ice echoed down quiet alleyways. Moving amid the gentle flurries was a man in a dark overcoat, his collar turned up against the biting cold. On any ordinary day, with the formalities of state, he would have had a full security entourage. Tonight, however, he was alone. This was Vladimir Putin, President of the Russian Federation. Though dressed so modestly that few would recognize him by sight, he often took these solitary walks when his schedule and his guarded lifestyle allowed it. In these moments, he sought clarity, listening to the hushed pulse of the city that he governed. He walked through a neighborhood not far from the Kremlin, recalling how, as a young boy in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, he used to wander the streets out of curiosity, searching for small adventures. Even then, he had admired the austere beauty of Russia's winters, though they brought hardship for many. The snowdrifts, the howling winds, the loneliness that settled over the roads, these things reminded him both of the resilience required to endure the Russian climate and of the deeper struggles that shaped the country he led. On this particular evening, with moonlight filtering through the clouds, he turned down a silent side street. At the far end, a dim street lamp cast a pool of light onto uneven cobblestones. Beneath the pale glow, he saw an elderly man huddled against the wall, bundled in ragged layers. A small dog sat at his feet, skinny and trembling, its ears perked up as if listening intently to the wind. The old man clutched a piece of bread, stale and meager, and was carefully breaking off fragments. Rather than saving the majority for himself, he extended each small bit to the dog, who ate them with grateful, hungry snaps. The man's breath billowed in faint white clouds, and Putin could see that he shivered visibly even beneath his threadbare coat. For some reason, the sight pierced Putin's thoughts. In all his travels and political endeavors, he had witnessed countless faces of poverty, but seeing this man's selfless act, sharing what little he had with a helpless animal, gripped him in a deeply personal way. He paused on the edge of the light, uncertain whether to approach or keep his distance. This wasn't the typical scenario a head of state found himself in, but something tugged at his conscience. Perhaps it was the recollection of his own family's post-war hardships. His parents had endured the brutal siege of Leningrad during World War II, surviving on scraps of bread and watery soup. They'd shown him, even in times of dire scarcity, how kindness could prevail. That lesson still resonated with him. He stepped forward, boots crunching in the snow. The old man looked up with startled eyes. The dog let out a small defensive growl, but quickly backed down when Putin approached slowly, hands visible and open. The man's gaze flicked over Putin's face, then his clothing, perhaps noticing it was of decent quality, though not ostentatious. If the man recognized him as president, he gave no sign. "Good evening," Putin said softly, voice calm. He used the polite form of address in Russian, hoping to put the old man at ease. "It's a cold night." The man nodded without speaking, his lined face marked by a lifetime of hardship. He held a leftover crumb of bread between his fingers, uncertain whether to hand it to the dog or save it for himself. At last, he offered it to the dog, gently patting its head. "Are you alone out here?" Putin asked. A bitter laugh escaped the man's chapped lips, though it was barely audible above the wind. "Yes, I sleep nearby. There's a heating vent that keeps away the worst of the frost." He hesitated, then added, "I share what I can with this stray. She's all I have, really." Putin glanced around. He knew this area, a district where abandoned buildings and cramped apartments lined the streets. He thought of all the large-scale policy discussions he had about poverty, unemployment, and economic reforms. Yet those discussions felt abstract compared to this immediate human reality. He knelt, hands brushing the icy ground, and the dog sniffed at his fingers. Her brown eyes were wary but not hostile. Gently, he stroked the dog's ears. Then, turning his gaze to the man, Putin saw the exhaustion etched into every crease of his face. "Let me help you," Putin said quietly. The old man blinked as though he hadn't heard correctly. People rarely offered him help unless it was an annoyed policeman ordering him to move along or a passerby tossing a coin. The sincerity in Putin's voice made him pause. "You don't need to worry about me," the man managed, though his voice trembled. "I'm used to it out here. But if you have any extra bread, Putin stood and reached into his coat pockets. Of course, he carried no significant amount of food, but he had some rubles, more than enough to provide a meal and then some. Let me find you a place that's warm, he insisted. You shouldn't be out here in this weather. At that moment, the dog sneezed, a tiny sound that punctured the silence. Putin glanced at the man's trembling hands, saw the rawness around his fingertips. His eyes flicked to the battered boots barely holding together around the man's feet, the remnants of thread used to stitch the leather. It was a painful scene. A man so close to losing what little he had left, and yet maintaining enough humanity to feed a helpless creature before himself. He made a decision then. Some distance behind them, waiting inconspicuously, was a plain black car that often followed him on these night walks, driven by one of the more trusted members of his security detail. Putin gently guided the man and the dog toward that car. The man's steps were unsteady at first, and he leaned against Putin's arm for support, seeming both astonished and too tired to protest. When they reached the vehicle, the driver exited, recognized the silent instruction, and opened the rear door. Carefully, they settled the old man inside. The dog hesitated, looking uncertainly between its longtime companion and these strangers. But with coaxing from Putin, it hopped into the seat. The heater was on, and the sudden warmth caused the old man to exhale a shaky breath of relief. Putin slid in beside him, shutting the door to block out the swirling snow. "Sir, is everything all right?" the driver asked quietly, addressing Putin by a respectful term that revealed a subtle hint of his true identity. The old man noticed the nuance, his brow furrowing, but he said nothing. "It's fine," Putin responded. "Take us to the safe house near the embankment." He paused, then spoke more gently. "We'll figure everything out from there." The car glided off into the night, merging onto wider streets illuminated by glowing street lamps, passing elegant historical facades and more modern, boxy buildings. The old man's eyes drifted to the windows, where he glimpsed the city that had, for so long, been unkind to him. He seemed torn between gratitude and an ingrained fear of trusting strangers. Meanwhile, Putin's thoughts churned. He had spent his adult life navigating the intricacies of politics, from Soviet times to the post-Soviet economic chaos, from the KGB background to the very pinnacle of Russian leadership. He was used to analyzing power struggles and forging alliances. But in this quiet moment, none of that mattered as much as the simple question, how could he help this one vulnerable man? After a short drive, they arrived at an understated building with minimal markings. Under normal circumstances, it served as a discreet government guest facility. Tonight, it would serve as a haven for a homeless stranger and his dog. The driver assisted the old man out of the car, and Putin followed, cradling the dog in his arms when it shivered, uncertain about walking on the snowy sidewalk. Inside, a startled receptionist and a pair of silent staff members recognized Putin at once, though they were trained to mask their reactions. They exchanged wordless glances, quickly ushering the group through a side hallway. The building's interior was warm and brightly lit. The old man's eyes darted around, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Clean floors, simple desk with a telephone, a sofa, potted plants that added color to the otherwise utilitarian decor. They settled the man in a small room with a bed, blankets, and a heater. The dog leapt onto the foot of the bed, curling up as though staking a claim. Carefully, the old man eased off his boots, wincing as circulation returned to his numb feet. Putin asked a staff member to bring fresh clothes, hot tea, and some soup. For a while, the old man simply sat there, staring at his hands as though waiting for someone to tell him this was a dream. Then a weary smile began to edge onto his face. "Thank you," he murmured, finally gathering enough courage to meet Putin's gaze. "I'm not sure what I did to deserve this kindness." Putin remained standing, arms crossed loosely, observing the man's fragile state. "Sometimes," he said softly, "it's enough that you exist. No one deserves to freeze on the streets." The old man nodded as though too overwhelmed to speak further. When the food arrived, he reached for the bowl of soup, inhaling its steam. He quickly broke off small pieces of the bread that accompanied it, offering one to the dog, a habit too ingrained to break. The dog devoured it hungrily, then settled back into a contented huddle. As the staff retreated, Putin moved a chair closer to the bed. He introduced himself simply as Vladimir, withholding his full title. The old man accepted this explanation without comment. Perhaps he already suspected who this man might be. Or perhaps he simply didn't care in that moment. All that mattered was that a stranger had shown him a rare act of compassion. They spoke quietly. The old man's name was Alexander. He had grown up in a rural part of Russia, later moving to Moscow in the 1970s in search of work. He had once been employed at a small factory that closed during the economic turmoil of the 1990s. Without steady work, he eventually lost the ability to pay rent. Over the years, the city's labyrinthine bureaucracy, combined with his failing health, had rendered him invisible. Still, he had found the dog, whom he called Zoya, wandering around an abandoned lot. From the moment she followed him, the two were inseparable. Alexander, despite his desperate circumstances, shared whatever meager food he could find. In return, Zoya stayed close, providing comfort in a world that often seemed too harsh for both of them. Listening to Alexander's story, Putin felt a pang of recognition. He was reminded of the tumultuous collapse of the Soviet Union, the wild 1990s with rampant inflation, privatization deals that benefited a select few, and millions who found themselves adrift. Most overcame these hardships in time, but many did not. Alexander was one of those who had slipped through the cracks. As president, Putin had often spoken about restoring stability and pride to Russia. But the existence of people like Alexander made the gap between policy rhetoric and on-the-ground reality starkly clear. They talked for a while longer. By the time Alexander's soup bowl was empty, he could hardly keep his eyes open. Exhaustion overtook him, so Putin rose quietly, letting the old man rest. At the door, he dimmed the lights. Zoya stirred, lifted her head, but quickly went back to nestling against Alexander's side. Before stepping into the corridor, Putin whispered one more assurance. "We'll figure out a way to help you get back on your feet." Then he left the room, closing the door with a gentle click. Outside, a pair of staff members awaited instructions. Putin told them to watch over Alexander and his dog, provide whatever they needed, and keep it confidential. The staff, loyal and discreet, simply nodded. As Putin walked through the hallways, a myriad of thoughts rolled through his mind. The dissonance between large-scale governance and one small personal act of aid. The memory of that moment in the alley, Alexander giving bread to his dog, despite having so little himself, clung to him. Soon he was back in the black car, heading toward the Kremlin. The driver, maintaining respectful silence, navigated the nearly empty streets. The night seemed darker now, though the snowfall had lessened. The city lights shimmered on windows and rooftops. Leaning back against the seat, Putin stared out at the fleeting scenery, mind filled with conflicting emotions. That single encounter reminded him how far Russia had come from the dire circumstances of the late 1990s, but also how many remained left behind. Over the following days, Alexander stayed in that discreet facility. Medical checkups revealed that he was malnourished, suffered from chronic bronchitis, and had mild frostbite on his fingers and toes. The staff provided treatment, hot meals, vitamins, rest, and new clothes. The dog Zoya was given veterinary attention, a bath, and a proper kennel to sleep in, though she preferred curling up near Alexander whenever she could. Gradually, Alexander's strength returned. Putin, though busy with his official duties, received periodic updates. A quiet relief settled on him, knowing Alexander was improving. And yet, an even deeper realization took root. There were countless others in similar conditions, not just in Moscow, but across the country. He reflected on what difference it would make if every leader, every public servant, took a moment to address such realities firsthand. One late afternoon, after finishing a meeting regarding diplomatic talks with foreign ministers, Putin slipped away from the labyrinth of offices in the Kremlin and returned to the facility. This time, he wore a simple gray suit and an unremarkable overcoat. Security accompanied him at a distance. When he entered Alexander's room, he found the old man dressed in fresh clothes, sipping tea by the window. Zoya dozed on the bed. Alexander rose awkwardly, unsure of the proper etiquette. He recognized now that Vladimir was not just any kind-hearted stranger. The staff's deference, the silent tension in the air, these things made his savior's identity unmistakable. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the realization that the president of Russia had personally come to see him. Putin approached with an easy smile, gesturing for him to sit. "How are you feeling?" he asked in a conversational tone. "I trust they're taking good care of you?" "Yes, thank you," Alexander replied quietly. He cast his gaze downward, humility evident in every line of his face. Then in a trembling voice he added, "I never thought I'd share a room with you." Putin waved off the formalities. "I'm just a public servant," he replied, using a phrase he sometimes employed when he wanted to emphasize humility. "And tonight, I came to speak to you about your future." Alexander's eyes flicked up. "My future?" he echoed, as if it were a concept he'd given up on years ago. Putin nodded, pulling up a wooden chair so they could speak at the same level. He explained in straightforward terms that his office would help Alexander obtain new identification documents, track down any pension or social benefits he might be entitled to, and find a modest place to live. There could even be assistance in locating a part-time job, something that wouldn't be too physically demanding. Zoya was, of course, welcome to stay by his side. Tears welled up in Alexander's eyes, and he struggled to form words. For so long, he'd lived as if invisible, convinced that no one saw him as anything more than a nuisance. Now he found it almost impossible to process that the highest figure in the Russian government was arranging a path forward for him. Finally, he managed to say, "I have nothing to give in return." "You've already given something priceless," Putin replied, voice gentle but resolute. "You showed kindness when you had so little. That's an example for all of us." They spoke a while longer, discussing Alexander's work history, what tasks he could manage. He was too old for hard labor, but perhaps he could assist in a local shelter or community center, something that allowed him dignity and a small income. The conversation was practical but tinged with warmth. Two Russians with vastly different life stories, yet sharing a moment of genuine connection. The dog, sensing the peaceful atmosphere, hopped off the bed and nudged Putin's leg. He reached down and patted its head, recalling how he'd first seen the two of them huddled in the cold. By nightfall, Putin left the facility. Alexander stood in the hallway to watch him go, confusion and gratitude mingling on his face. Over the next few weeks, the promised documents were processed, official stamps were placed on forms, and distant records were unearthed confirming Alexander's past employment. Bit by bit, a life that had unraveled on the streets was now being stitched back together. During that time, the staff cared for Alexander, and he gained some weight, recovering from years of neglect. Zoya, once scrawny and nervous, grew more energetic. Despite the significant progress, Putin knew the real test was what came after Alexander left the facility. Paperwork alone wouldn't solve all problems, but at least it was a start, a foundation upon which a man could rebuild his life. Meanwhile, in the broader world of Russian politics, daily events surged on. Negotiations with other heads of state, debates in the Duma, public appearances, interviews, and the constant chatter of foreign media analyzing every move Putin made. He addressed issues of security, energy policy, and Russia's role on the global stage. Yet in the back of his mind, he often drifted to the memory of that snowy alley, remembering how a small act of compassion from a homeless man had deeply stirred him. It reminded him that the soul of a nation is reflected not only in its grand accomplishments or military parades, but in the quiet depth of its people's humanity. As the weeks turned into a couple of months, Alexander was discharged from the facility with a clean bill of health. He was presented with new identification papers, and a modest, city-subsidized apartment was arranged for him. Small, just a single room with a kitchenette, but it was warm, safe, and his. He stepped across the threshold with awe, cradling Zoya in his arms. He ran a hand over the walls, hardly believing they belonged to him. The city social services team had furnished it with basic necessities: a bed, a table, a heater. One of the staff members handed Alexander a slip of paper with an address and a note explaining that there was a local community center where he could volunteer, possibly leading to a small stipend. Alexander swallowed hard, tears brimming. He glanced down at Zoya, who wagged her tail, as if sensing a hopeful future. The staff members bade him farewell, reminding him to call if he needed anything. They left him standing in the dim, warm light of a space he could finally call home. That evening, when Alexander prepared a simple meal for himself, just soup he'd heated on a stove, he felt an unfamiliar sense of freedom. No longer was he worried about being chased from a doorway by angry property owners or patrolled by police who would force him to move along. He had walls around him, a roof over his head, a door he could lock. And as for Zoya, she wagged her tail each time he glanced at her, as if to say, "We made it." In the days that followed, Alexander found a routine. He walked to the community center, introduced himself to the staff. They recognized his name from the documents, and a manager there offered him a small role assisting in the kitchen, washing dishes, sometimes peeling potatoes. It was work that Alexander could handle physically, and the center was understanding about the need for breaks if his back ached. They paid him a humble wage, but he treasured every ruble. He recognized other people who had faced hardships. Some were disabled, some were single mothers, some were older folks like him, just trying to survive in a city that had grown more expensive over the years. Quietly, Alexander flourished. He saved small amounts of money from each paycheck, enough to keep Zoya well-fed, and occasionally enough to buy a treat from the local bakery. The transformation seemed almost miraculous to him, a man who, just months prior, had resigned himself to living and dying on the streets. Every day in a private moment, he thought of that night in the alley and the stranger who had knelt to help him. He still had never uttered Putin's full name in any direct conversation, partly from lingering disbelief, partly from a sense of awe. Meanwhile, in his private chambers, Putin received word that Alexander was doing well. He insisted on periodic updates from the staff, wanting to ensure that the old man wasn't forgotten in a swirl of bureaucracy. Each time he heard of Alexander's small triumphs, like landing the volunteer job or improving physically, Putin felt a quiet satisfaction. Sometimes, looking out over the city from the Kremlin's windows, he pondered how much good might be accomplished if every person in power made a habit of stepping into the shadows of their domain to witness real life. The thought stayed with him. But large nations are not governed by single acts of charity. There were still crises to face. Some critics might have dismissed Putin's personal intervention as a PR stunt if they'd known about it. Yet there had been no media coverage, no official statements. It was not mentioned in press briefings. In that sense, it was entirely genuine. An act done for the sake of humanity, not political gain. One afternoon, as Alexander was returning from the community center, Zoya trotting happily at his side, he paused near a park bench to rest. Overhead, the skies were gray, hinting that more snow might come soon. A few teenagers rode bicycles, weaving around pedestrians. Elderly couples fed pigeons near the bare branches of birch trees. Alexander felt the crispness in the air and drew his coat tighter, remembering how previously this kind of weather meant bracing for a miserable night on the streets. Now it was merely an invitation to hurry home, where warmth awaited him. He sat on the bench for a few minutes, recalling distant memories. His first arrival in Moscow, his younger days when he believed in the bright future promised by official propaganda. He thought of how life had led him through harsh paths. Then in a moment of gratitude, he looked down at Zoya, scratching her behind the ears. She gazed back at him with unwavering loyalty. A lump formed in his throat, reflecting on how she had stayed with him through times so bleak he could hardly endure them himself. Gently, he said, "We're safe now, girl. We're finally safe." In that moment, he remembered how Vladimir had once told him, "Sometimes it's enough that you exist." Alexander closed his eyes. Those words had felt so foreign at the time, yet they had given him hope. He had never been a prominent figure, never held an important position, never boasted a well-known family name. But somehow, a man who wielded more power than almost anyone else in Russia saw him as worthy of compassion. Eventually, Alexander stood, gave Zoya a reassuring pat, and continued walking, letting the small dog lead the way back to the little apartment. His footsteps were steadier now. He no longer had to glance over his shoulder for danger or freeze at the thought of having nowhere to go. With every block he passed, his confidence grew in step with his new lease on life. On the other side of the city, in a gilded office within the Kremlin, Putin was finishing up a session with advisors. They had been discussing new social initiatives, programs to help the elderly, to improve housing and healthcare. Though such meetings were part of his routine, today there was an extra layer of personal resonance. He knew one face that represented the countless unseen, and so he closed the folder of policy papers with a sense of renewed purpose. On the cover page, there were graphs and statistics, but in his mind's eye, there was Alexander and Zoya, symbols of hope and resilience amid the daunting expanse of Russia's societal challenges. With the meeting concluded, Putin excused himself. In a private corridor, he took a moment to reflect. He allowed himself the luxury of remembering that snowy evening. No cameras, no fanfare, just a man and his dog, and a leader who had chosen to stop. He thought about how small acts could sometimes ripple outward in ways one couldn't fully predict. Had he kept walking that night, too preoccupied with state affairs, Alexander might still be freezing on those lonely streets. Or worse. There was a time earlier in Putin's life, when he was still forging his identity in the KGB, that he had learned about the concept of provodnik, or a conductor, someone who facilitated the movement of things from one place to another. In his official capacity, he was a conductor of policies, laws, power. But in this personal matter, he felt like a conductor of compassion, bridging the gap between Alexander's plight and the resources that could change it. He made his way to a window overlooking the city. The onion domes and spires of Moscow stretched across the horizon. Snow had begun to fall again in lazy flurries, dusting rooftops and roads. And somewhere out there, an old man and his faithful dog were enjoying the simple gift of a warm home. The thought humbled him. Russia was vast, with countless souls living their private struggles. This small triumph was but a sliver of what needed to happen on a grand scale. Yet every life touched was a life redeemed. Straightening his shoulders, Putin turned away from the window. He had more work to do. Far more. But a faint smile lingered at the edges of his expression, because he knew that sometimes a single act, like sharing a piece of bread, could illustrate the power of compassion in a way that no official decree ever could. He continued his late-night walks every so often, slipping into the quieter corners of Moscow with only a minimal security detail trailing some distance behind. Often those nights reminded him of the evening when he first encountered Alexander. The city streets changed with time. Shops opened or closed, construction sites rose up. But there were always people in need, always hidden stories unfolding out of sight. When he glanced at men selling newspapers on icy corners or elderly women huddling near storefronts, the memory of Alexander offered a living example of hope. If just one person could find a second chance, perhaps others might too. Alexander himself found steady footing at the community center. He pitched in with dishwashing, tidying up, and chatting with visitors who passed through. The center provided lunch to anyone who needed it, sometimes free of charge. Alexander would quietly note how many bowls of soup were left, how many loaves of bread were still available, and who might benefit from an extra portion. One afternoon, as he ladled hot borscht into a bowl for a frail-looking teenager, he felt a wave of recognition. Not long ago, he too had relied on the kindness of strangers. That memory, far from painful, steeled his resolve to pay kindness forward in any small way he could. Zoya became the unofficial mascot of the center. Everyone knew the small dog with the wagging tail and gentle eyes. Children who came with their parents, families who were scraping by, took turns patting her. Sometimes Zoya would trot after them playfully, brightening the rather austere space. Alexander often found himself chuckling over her antics, amazed at how much his life had changed since the night he nearly froze on a Moscow street. Winter gave way to a muddy spring. Gray skies turned to occasional sunshine, and the roadsides revealed fresh patches of earth where snow once lay thick. Alexander saved enough money to replace his old boots, and he picked out a warmer jacket for the next season. Day by day, his health improved. The mild stiffness in his limbs persisted, a legacy of those harsh years outside. But overall, he felt stronger. Each dawn gave him a renewed sense of purpose. News spread, quietly and only among a few, that Alexander was the man the president had personally helped. People at the community center sometimes spoke in hushed tones, wondering if the rumor was true. Alexander, typically modest, neither confirmed nor denied the details. Yet there was a quiet pride in his posture whenever Vladimir was mentioned. He would remember the reassuring warmth in that man's voice, the gentle way he had coaxed Zoya into the backseat of the car, and the promise he had made. "We'll figure out a way to help you." Months rolled on. Putin continued to tackle the daily trials of governance. Russia's vast territory and historical complexities meant there was never a shortage of urgent matters. Economic sanctions, military affairs, energy exports, these and countless other issues demanded attention. But in discussions related to social welfare, he often found himself recalling Alexander's story. Without naming him, Putin would occasionally reference the strength of one who has nothing, or the quiet resilience that defines our nation. He pushed for expanded outreach programs for the homeless, additional funding for shelters, and streamlined paperwork for lost documentation. Though these initiatives took time to gain traction, they were small steps toward aiding those on the margins. Summer arrived, and with it came a mild heat in the city. Alexander continued working at the community center. They had enough volunteers now to organize a weekly meal service, distributing food to people who still lived on the streets. Alexander sometimes went along, walking the same sidewalks where he had once sought a spot to sleep. The contrast struck him deeply. He would hand out soup or pieces of bread, remembering how desperate he had been for the smallest morsel. Zoya followed, tail wagging at every stranger. Some recognized Alexander, eyes lighting up as if to say, "We thought you were lost out here forever." Late one afternoon, a local official visited the community center. She was a middle-aged woman with a professional demeanor, but a genuine warmth in her voice. She explained there was going to be a modest ceremony in a government hall not far from the Kremlin, a recognition event for everyday heroes. The official read a list of people who would be honored: a firefighter who had saved a child from an apartment blaze, a teacher who had dedicated decades to underfunded schools, and yes, Alexander's name was on the list. Alexander gaped at her in disbelief. "This must be a mistake," he murmured, voice unsteady. "I've done nothing extraordinary." She shook her head. "You represent hope for those who slip through the cracks. You've shown that second chances matter." Alexander stared at his feet, a sudden wave of shyness overtaking him. But the official pressed a formal invitation into his hand. "Please be there," she said softly. Word spread among the center's volunteers. People congratulated him, patted him on the back. He felt a rush of conflicting emotions, pride mixed with a little fear. Public ceremonies were far from his comfort zone, yet a quiet voice inside told him he owed it to himself and to those still struggling to accept. The day before the event, he tried to tidy up his best shirt and slacks. A neighbor in his apartment complex, a kindly older woman, ironed them for him, chattering cheerfully as she did so. She had heard rumors of his past, but never pried. For her, Alexander was a friendly tenant who said good morning and occasionally helped carry groceries. On the day of the ceremony, Alexander arrived early at the Grand Hall. He was escorted through wide corridors lined with portraits of historical figures. He half expected to be turned away, convinced someone would realize he was merely a man who had once been homeless, not a hero. But the ushers directed him to a seat in the front row, near others who wore solemn yet proud expressions. Lights glowed overhead, illuminating a small stage. The sound of low chatter echoed in the ornate space. When it was Alexander's turn, an official speaker called him to the podium. He rose on unsteady legs and walked to the stage, swallowing hard. From the microphone, the official announced that Alexander was being recognized for his compassion, for exemplifying the spirit of generosity in dire circumstances. There was no mention of Putin's direct involvement. The focus was on Alexander's story, how he never abandoned Zoya despite having barely enough for himself, how he now worked selflessly at the community center to help others in need. There was polite applause. Alexander stood there, face reddening, nerves alight. He wished he had the eloquence to express the depth of his gratitude. As he glanced around the hall, his eyes landed on a figure seated quietly among higher officials. A man in a dark suit, posture straight, face composed, their eyes locked. It was the same face Alexander had seen under that snowy street lamp months ago. Alexander felt something catch in his throat. Putin inclined his head, a respectful nod that spoke volumes. In his gaze, Alexander read encouragement, as if to say, "It's all right. You belong here." Mustering courage, Alexander cleared his throat into the microphone. "I'm not special," he began. His voice trembled, so he paused to steady himself. "I'm just grateful. Grateful that I had one more chance. Grateful for the kindness shown to me when I had nothing to offer." He hesitated, eyes drifting to the small gathering of city officials and volunteers who had helped him rebuild his life. "I'd like to remind everyone that there are still many out there who need help. People who've lost their homes, their jobs, their hope. If my story shows anything, it's that a little compassion can change a life." The applause was stronger this time. In the audience, a few people dabbed at their eyes. Putin remained still, but the flicker of a smile curved at the edge of his lips. When Alexander stepped off the stage, an usher led him to a seat among others who had been honored that day. Awards were distributed, small medals or certificates acknowledging quiet heroism. Alexander received a modest medal, a symbol of recognition he never thought he'd hold in his hands. He stared down at it with wonder. After the ceremony, there was a reception in an adjoining hall. Attendees chatted over tea and biscuits. Alexander felt a bit lost in the crowd of well-dressed officials and local dignitaries. He held the medal in his calloused palm, uncertain of where to stand. Then he sensed a presence behind him, turning to find himself face to face with Putin. The hush that fell around them was palpable. People near them stepped back, allowing a private moment. Putin spoke quietly. "You did well up there." He glanced at the medal in Alexander's hand. "Congratulations. I hope you know you earned this." Alexander swallowed, heart pounding. He bowed his head slightly. "Thank you for everything. Without your help, I wouldn't be standing here." Putin paused, then responded in a voice that was calm yet firm. "If I learned anything, it's that our country's strength isn't measured only by wealth or power. It's measured by how we treat those who have the least." Alexander nodded. His eyes glistened with unshed tears. Putin offered him a handshake, which Alexander accepted with trembling fingers. Then, in a more conversational tone, Putin added, "How's Zoya doing?" At this, Alexander let out a small laugh, the tension easing. "She's wonderful, getting spoiled every day at the center." A fleeting warmth passed between them. Though one was a man of towering authority and the other an ordinary citizen, they stood on common ground in that moment. Putin asked no more questions about Alexander's circumstances. He seemed content to see that the old man was well, alive, and moving forward. After exchanging a few more remarks, Putin excused himself to greet other honorees. Alexander watched him go, reflecting on how surreal this entire journey had been. The reception wound down. Journalists drifted through, interviewing various people, but there was no sensational coverage focusing on Alexander's backstory. Only a small handful of them were aware of the deeper connection between him and the president, and even fewer dared to publish such a personal anecdote without official statements. Over time, the story might surface in rumors, or perhaps remain a quiet legend. Alexander was content either way. He returned to his modest apartment that evening, medal in hand, mind swirling with gratitude and disbelief. Back in his apartment, he set the medal on the kitchen table. Zoya greeted him with her usual enthusiasm, hopping around on her hind legs. He scooped her up, pressing his cheek to the top of her head. "We did it," he whispered, voice shaky. Then he placed the medal in a small wooden box he'd kept since his youth, a box that had once held relics of a more hopeful past. Now it held something more precious, proof that he mattered. The subsequent weeks were calm and uneventful. Alexander resumed his volunteer work, quietly helping new arrivals at the center. Sometimes he shared bits of his own story to encourage those feeling hopeless. He spoke of the turning point in his life, how a single act of human kindness had proven more powerful than all the struggles he endured. People listened, often in disbelief, yet the sincerity in his voice made them dream that their fates too could change. One crisp morning, Alexander decided to visit the same alley where his life had pivoted. His shift at the center didn't start for a couple of hours, so he had time. The weather was brisk but not freezing. He wound his way through familiar streets, some improved by recent construction, others still worn by time. When he reached the alley, he stood at its mouth, letting memories flood in. He could see the ghostly image of himself shivering on the ground, offering crumbs of bread to Zoya. He closed his eyes, recalling the surprise he felt when footsteps approached and a warm voice spoke. Zoya sniffed around, intrigued by the sense of a place she hadn't returned to in months. Alexander knelt, patting her back. "Remember this spot, girl? We were so close to giving up." A wave of emotion swept through him, but it wasn't sadness. It was gratitude for everything that had happened since. He no longer feared the biting cold or the loneliness of the streets. He had a home, a purpose, and a renewed sense of his own worth. All of it stemmed from a simple encounter. Two human beings, worlds apart, but connected by a single thread of compassion. Time carried on, and eventually the story of Alexander and his dog reached the ears of ordinary Russians in small, scattered ways. Some said they heard about a homeless man rescued by a powerful stranger. Others told tales of a dog that led a man to help a beggar. Facts got twisted, exaggerated, retold in rumor, but the core of it always remained. Kindness persisted even in the harshest conditions. Some found inspiration in that rumor, whispering that if the president himself could see fit to help a nameless old man on a cold night, perhaps there was still hope for a more empathetic society. For Putin, daily life returned to its usual demands. Long hours in his office, tours to different regions, high-level meetings with foreign dignitaries. But whenever he signed documents improving social measures or expanding outreach for those in need, a quiet satisfaction underpinned his formal demeanor. He remembered that behind every statistic was a face like Alexander's. Occasionally, on particularly stressful evenings, he might glance out a Kremlin window at the vast city, letting his thoughts linger on that night. He never gave an official speech about it, never turned it into a public relations story. It stayed in the realm of a personal conviction, perhaps the purest form of leadership he could offer. And so the seasons cycled again, from summer to autumn, from autumn to another cold winter. Alexander continued living quietly in his small apartment, now decorated with a few photographs. One photo showed him smiling at the community center with Zoya in his arms, flanked by volunteers. Another was a snapshot he'd kept from decades ago, a younger Alexander, once optimistic about forging a better life in Moscow. Each day, when he returned from the center and turned the key in his door, he reminded himself how different life had been not so long ago. In gentle moments of reflection, he acknowledged that his gratitude extended beyond the extraordinary rescue. It included every friend at the center, every stranger who had slipped him a coin when he was on the street, every staff member who had offered him a bed at that government facility. Most of all, it included the memory of that man in a dark overcoat who found him in an alley and said simply, "Let me help you." The story became part of Alexander's essence, his private legend of transformation. If people asked him, he described it as a miracle. Others might have called it destiny or just a rare stroke of luck. But in Alexander's view, it was proof that sometimes a single moment of kindness can outweigh the hardships of a lifetime. And if one moment can change one life, perhaps a million such moments can change a country or even the world. Late one evening, on a night reminiscent of the fateful one so long ago, Alexander was walking home, Zoya padding faithfully at his side. Snowflakes tumbled from the sky, glittering in the lamplight. He glanced at the windows of tall buildings, some glowing with warmth, others dark. He felt no bitterness, only a simple, profound peace. As he made his way to his apartment, he quietly hummed an old folk tune. Zoya's ears twitched at the sound, and she looked up at him, tail wagging as though she understood. When he finally entered his building, stomping snow off his boots, he paused on the landing. In the hallway, he saw a neighbor's child curled up on the stairs, waiting for her mother to return from work. Alexander knelt, asking if she was okay. She nodded but looked tired. Without hesitation, Alexander took off his scarf, gently wrapped it around her shoulders, and sat with her until she felt warmer. Zoya settled beside them, offering the little girl a silent companion. In that quiet act, Alexander recognized the same spirit that had saved him. Small gestures, freely offered, could mean the difference between despair and hope. He helped the girl back to her apartment a short while later, then headed upstairs to his own door. Inside, he set down his keys, shrugged off his coat, and patted Zoya's head. He smiled at the photograph of himself with the volunteers, the corners of his eyes crinkling with contentment. One day, people might forget the details of how he was saved or who he had been, but he would never forget, and he would do his best to ensure that others learned from his story, even if they only caught glimpses of it in rumors or half-remembered news snippets. Far away in the corridors of power, Putin wrapped up another late meeting. Snow dusted the Kremlin walls, and the hush of the city night beckoned him outside. Glancing at the time, he considered taking another of his unannounced walks. Perhaps, he thought, he might again find someone in need of a helping hand. The work of a leader was unending, and so was the opportunity to show compassion. Pulling on a dark coat, he stepped out into the snowy courtyard, taking a deep breath of the frosty air. The city lights shimmered, and a faint sense of purpose guided his footsteps. He didn't know if destiny would lead him to another life in crisis that night, but he was ready to meet it if it did. As he walked off into the swirls of snow, somewhere across Moscow, Alexander fell into a peaceful sleep, secure in the knowledge that human kindness could flourish against even the harshest backdrop. Their stories remained separate yet intricately linked, a testament to the power of empathy across the divide of status and circumstance. And in the silent dance of snowflakes drifting from sky to street, one could sense that a single act of compassion might resonate far beyond the moment it is given, echoing in the hearts of those who witness or experience it, reminding each person that hope lives on, even in the coldest of nights.